Hi, I'm Angelo Robles of Family Office Association. Welcome to our FOA Successful Families Project, today featuring communication. Today's panelists include Warren Whitaker of Day Pitney, Cindy Puccio of Individual U, Larry Steibel of Steibel, Peabody and Associates, Scott Wakeman of Family Navigation Strategies, Sharna Goldsecker of 2164, and Don O'Patterney of the Lovins Group. Hello everyone, I'm Angelo Robles of Family Office Association. Welcome for joining our FOA Successful Families Project. Our session today is on family communication. Scott, I'm going to start with you. Why is family communication so important to sustaining a successful family?
Family communication, in my mind, equates to a blood flow in a body. With good blood flow, you're providing energy to all of the cells, and without it, you suffer from disease or possibly death. So from my perspective, communication is the lifeblood to any enterprise or any family in terms of setting the tone for how everyone and everything operates.
Don, I don't mean to make it sound so simple. Of course, communication within a family is going to be important to be on the same page, to avoid possible challenges, litigation at a point in the future. Although it sounds easy, why is it so hard?
I think conflict in families is as much of the lifeblood of families as is the things that connect us. I think all family members have this deep need for connection with one another, but simultaneously they also are programmed for autonomy and finding their own way in the world, which is at times different from their family. And in a way, the root of the word conflict is bringing two different things together. And I really think that that is a very important and energizing way of relating if we can find the way to more easily connect with each other around our differences and the way that we would like to express ourselves that may not fit within the rest of the group's ideas of what's right and what's wrong.
And Warren, from the perspective of an attorney with significant experience in the space, communicating doesn't mean necessarily always talking. We have two ears and one mouth. It means listening. And yes, I'll take a little pot shot at attorneys, that sometimes attorneys go in with a preconceived notion. Here's how I do it, here's what I think you need, and here's what I'm going to draw up, and if you listen to me, it'll be good, you'll save money, you'll have lasting bliss forever and ever. That never happens. Why should attorneys or broadly advisors be better at not only communicating themselves, but being able to help families foster communication to know what they want?
Well, I think you're right that a lot of attorneys don't listen to clients, and I think that's one of the most important things, to understand what the client's concerns are and then to be able to either explain those concerns if maybe they shouldn't be real concerns. They can be, people can be reassured. Or maybe they're concerns that make the whole estate plan basically non-viable, because those concerns are going to override any tax issues, any legal issues. But I think getting attorneys to listen, and for the attorney to listen carefully to the client, understand why the client is engaging in the process, what the client wants to get out of it, is absolutely critical.
Cindy, when is it ever too early to, as a parent of a substantial family, business or no business, to engage with the children? It sounds obvious. Of course you should listen and talk to your children. How open should you be with them? If you're a family that has ups and downs, which probably, forget the money, there's a variety of different factors, is everyone. When is too early?
I think a general rule of thumb with children of all ages really is thinking about delivering information that's accurate and honest and simple. So what very young children tend to do, if they sense that there is some type of an emotional buzz in the family, if something is happening, if there's an issue, regardless of the nature of that issue, if they're not told accurate information, oftentimes what they do is they piece together their own version of a story. They create an explanation, and oftentimes that's grossly inaccurate. So giving information that's simple, that's developmentally appropriate, sort of more in thinking of a Cliff Notes version, something that they can understand that's true, I think is really important.
And let's take it maybe to an age, Sharna, that would be a little older, maybe later teens, early 20s. Supposedly, they're emotionally developed, they're ready for it, they're entering into a stage, whether it's latter in high school, college, or whatever it may be. Communication at that age, I have a preteen, but could start to break down a little bit for a variety of reasons. How do you keep that line of, pardon the pun, communication open?
Sure. So I like to think of the metaphor of a bicycle. If anyone rides a bicycle, you know that it's actually the back wheel of the bike that, once pedaled, drives the whole bike forward. So sometimes we think about the front wheel of the bike being the content of information you want to share, and the back wheel of the bike being the process, the healthy communication that we've developed with our children to be able to drive the whole family forward. So the more we can, at an early age, set up the practice of meeting regularly, of communicating, of having space to ask hard questions and get clear, accurate answers, the more we'll be able to build on that as the children grow older and the information becomes more complex.
Larry, we had a chance to be introduced a couple of years ago when I read one of your wonderful articles, which I mentioned I have a preteen. At that time, he was 9 or 10, a couple of years back. And you wrote, I suppose, a fictitious article, but it still struck very home about how two different directions that parents went. One was, both of them, I believe, fictitious people were founding a company, and one was just so engrossed by the 12, 14, 16 hours of work and really disengaged or didn't have communication with the children. The other made it a point, even if it was as simple as being there for dinner or driving them to school in the morning, but was open, spoke about not only the positives, we're doing great, we're making tons of money, we're getting market share, but spoke about the challenges. And some of them were pretty open, and it was touching to me, and I found it very warm and personal. And maybe if you could share, as you're so good at, in a bit of a story format, why that's so important.
Well, Angelo, it's not a fictitious. It's a real client, and the story is as follows. This man comes to me and he says, "I grew up. My parents were blue collar. I was smart. I went to MIT." And shortly after I graduated, I started a business. And we were poor. And every morning I would get up and I would make breakfast for my 2 children. And then I would drive them to school. And all during the drive, I was so engrossed in myself. I never asked them about what their day was, but I kept talking about my day and what was going on in my life and what was my day going to look like and the drama of my day. And then it turned out that I didn't mean to be a good role model, but I was a good role model because the kids just absorbed all this drama and excitement and passion. And as they grew up, they got into business. One became an entrepreneur, one is employed, and they're really solid citizens, and I'm very proud of them. I turned out to be a great role model, and I didn't know that I was being a great role model at the time. Subsequently, I grew my business, sold my business, made a lot of money, divorced my first wife, got remarried, and had a second child. Now I'm living in a very nice house with a live-in maid. And the live-in maid makes breakfast for my son. And the maid drives my son to school. And I'm a distant figure. And my son only sees that I'm surrounded by people who want to be with me for my money, and I have a nice life. I'm in the hospital board. I'm on the board of companies, and I have a ski chalet, and my 16-year-old points at me and says, I could do that. I want to be like you. In other words, Larry, I'm a bad role model for my son. What are you going to do about it? That was my mission. But the idea was just talk with your kids about what's going on in your life. One of the things that I do find is in certain kinds of cultures, there is an idea that we should keep work and business separated. And I think that's dysfunctional. I think work and business needs to be together. I remember my daughter's here and watching this tape, and my wife and I worked together. The only time we could talk about business was over dinner. And so our daughter would be there, and we're talking, and I remember our daughter once interrupting us and says, can't you talk about me for some time? She was absolutely right, but she absorbed all the stuff we were talking about, and she's terrific. We turned out to be good role models even though we didn't know we were. You know?
Unintended consequences.
The motto is bring work home with you. Don't keep it separate. Show your kids what it means to work hard, to strive, to fail, to recover, so that the kids don't think of it as strange.
You give me a whole bunch of questions potentially to ask the group. And Sharna, families of wealth and success, they're busy. They have the opportunity to outsource. A word that I'm going to take on what Larry said about a maid, a driver for the kids. Just because they could doesn't mean they should. It's not a perfect world, and sometimes there'll be balance and compromise. But I'm assuming as parents and role models, we have to, no matter how busy or how wealthy or how successful, have to take an active role communicating and listening.
Yes, so as a working mom myself who runs her own business and has 2 children, I can empathize with the balance that we all try to achieve. In addition to the potential power of talking to your children, as Larry mentioned, I would add the meaningful opportunity to listen to your children. So how can we be around in the down moments, in addition to the highly structured interactions with our children, where we can just listen, where we can ask questions, where we can explore who they are, how they're feeling, what happened in the course of their day, and they can ask us questions that are on their minds that feel more accessible to ask in the moments when we're just spending time with one another. I think the way that that transitions into adulthood is that we become peers who do business together. And so children who feel comfortable sitting at the board table or the philanthropy table or the business round table with their parents have that familiarity of being heard and asking questions.
Warren, I don't mean to simplify it, and I'm sure in your decades of practice, you've had situations where there was parents or family members and their siblings and a riff or a challenge, possibly leading into litigation, if not litigation itself. I suppose that's inevitable, and that's probably, unfortunately, going to be more common than less common. I don't mean to simplify it by saying communication is the answer, but it's in the right direction. Do you have an obligation as an attorney to only listen and execute with your talents what the client wants, or do you try to be more encompassing and try to correct it before it becomes a bigger problem? Meaning, possibly the law firm will make less money.
Well, it's not the issue of the law firm making less money. I think it's an issue of what the client is looking for from the attorney. I think a lot of times you see a dysfunctional family and there's a limit to what you can do. There's a limit to what the family didn't come to the lawyer to solve those problems. And you could see, glaring difficulties, but you know that if you tell the father he's got to tell more to his children, he's got to deal with his children, he's going to say, who are you to tell me that? It's unfortunate. It's beyond a legal problem. Sure, it's a problem where psychologists should be brought in, but I cannot very easily say to a lot of these clients, you get your whole family into family therapy. So it's a problem when you see that. Certainly lawyers, to the extent that they can without offending clients, ought to indicate that communication is necessary. I certainly tell parents you're putting together this estate plan. Tell your kids what the estate plan is. Let them know what they're going to get. If one's going to get more, if one's going to have more control, let them know while you're still around. Don't surprise them when you're gone. They suddenly discover it. But again, there are limits to what a lawyer can do in a situation like that.
And Scott, as a family member of a family that had a substantial business, and in your case, I believe, second generation, you did share earlier, but we're now in a different video, perhaps a story of engagement, of communication that your father had with you, with other siblings, maybe at a younger point in life or a little bit older. I think that will be insightful for the audience.
My communication with Dad began at a very early age. When he started his business, I was 9 years old, and I was just old enough to have that sense of what he was up to. Spent a lot of time with him on weekends traveling to the business, and those were our family and business times together. I think my two younger brothers were somewhat disadvantaged because they were several years and 5 years younger than I was. And at an age of 5 and 3, they're not able to absorb the same kinds of things that I saw. So it's an example of where communication is disadvantaged by age. There's a message there, and it takes time for the others to develop some level of maturity in order to absorb the same kinds of information. And as well, 3 to 5 years down the road, I'm seeing my dad start a business. My brothers, unfortunately, couldn't see that aspect of their father as immediate as I could, so they're getting what was happening 5 years down the road after the business was able to get some momentum and become successful.
As at that point, was he too busy?
He always was able to carve out time to share his time with his family, albeit most of his time was spent at the business, trying to get that business up to a level of profitability, but it was very important for him to spend time with his children. One way or another, he managed to carve out that time. And my general sense is that a patriarch, a founder, spends a lot more time speaking downward to the next generation. And my experience of having been a second generation CEO is that at that point, you really need to be doing a lot more give and take, is what you were talking about. I have brothers involved, I have children involved, and so there is this tremendous need for consensus conversation where you're giving and taking from all of the family members. And that at that point included my mother and father. So it was a shift in the style of communication that became so critical, especially around second and third gen.
Don, in your experiences, what are the consequences of lack of proper communication, either in a family business or effectively trickling down to the family?
You know, it's interesting. I sometimes get hired, I think, when the building's already on fire and people feel like they're jumping out of the building. And sometimes I get hired where people recognize that's a possibility and they want to put in fire prevention systems. I mean, there's so many examples. I once worked with two identical twin brothers who, you'd think growing up in the same womb and, sharing so many of the same experiences would lead to a sense of closeness. But it's fascinating. They had so much closeness. They were so identified as one thing, like the twins, that when I engaged with them, their communication was so violent that their employees literally told me that they would go into their cars and cry at lunchtime because of the tension that was in the system. So, communication happens on various levels for various purposes. And I think when we talk about good communication, in some ways that was a good communication. It was actually fostering something these guys needed, which was distance. It just had horrific consequences for their family and for their employees, for their children. And so I think looking at communication process and what it really is trying to achieve is one of the things that I think most often we're looking for. consequences of not communicating verbally can be tremendous. I mean, people live with their own stories of what happened. I think that's what you were talking about earlier, Cindy. If they're not given appropriate information, people live with very deeply held conflicts inside of themselves, which actually really belong, in the family system. And so consequences of that can be tragic. People can literally, when they feel like they're in an experience where someone else is, a bully and they're feeling a bit like the victim, and they don't actually talk about that in an appropriate way, they can actually take both of those inside of themselves and end their own lives, being both their own villain and their own victim. We've seen tragic stories of very public divorces, and I mean, in my practice, we've seen stories of tragic divorces that get into the public arena, and then the children actually suffer significantly because of that. And had those couples actually been able to look at some of the things they had been communicating about, sometimes very intensely, for specific purposes, in another format with a different kind of container, those kinds of consequences may have been avoidable.
Cindy, should families with younger children set aside time 5 out of 7 days a week for dinner? We're going to be together, no TV, no cell phone, and we're going to talk. Is that a little rigid? Is setting aside time different from dinner, 8 to 10 every night? Is it good to be that structured to force an opportunity to have communication?
That all sounds good to me so far, what you said. Rigid or not rigid.
Forcing is good.
I think, I was thinking about this when you were speaking, Larry, about the dad and putting the kids on the bus and having breakfast with them each morning, that I often talk to parents who feel guilty about not spending enough time with their kids, that establishing as many emotional routines as you can possibly establish with your kids can be so helpful. So one very obvious routine that we have in the American culture is reading to a child before bed. That can't always happen. But what you were talking about was there was this takeaway, this sleeper effect of this being an emotional time, a connection. Dad didn't know it at the time, but it was very meaningful to the kids. So any time where parent can establish an emotional routine, and that can be anything. That can be putting a note in a lunchbox if a parent is gone, but there needs to be consistency with that, and it needs to be human to human, meaningful connection. And I think that even when parents aren't there, because oftentimes for work demands or traveling, kids are so reliant on routine and first and foremost on emotional routine, and that just really means emotional connection. It needs to be consistent. So my very biased view of time spent together as a family around a dinner table, I mean, I think all of that is wonderful. I think the reality is that it doesn't happen as much as it should for most families for various reasons, but I think that parents need to then take a step back and say, okay, this can't happen. How do I plug something else in? Because if the connection between parent and child is not emotionally satisfying to both, then the priorities really do need to be shifted, and there needs to be a reboot. And we all, whether we know it or not, we wake up and we set our priorities for the day. And if your children aren't on that list, and not to be at the top of the list every day, they can be somewhere. But if they're not on it, then something needs to change.
You said that a lot of parents feel guilty about not spending enough time. I think that's a good thing because it shows that they are concerned and they're focusing on it.
Right, that's a good point.
I don't think that was true a couple generations ago.
Right, they wouldn't even be aware of it. That's interesting. Yeah, I think
Larry?
that's true.
I think to take what you said, in our work, we really sort of say, let's assume everybody's intentions are honorable and good. And still, it's not going to be enough. What you need is structure. So one of the things, and this gets back to what Cindy was saying, the car. The car is full of distraction devices. The kids in the back seats of the car have iPads and they can be watching movies. They could be playing games. The person on the passenger side could be on a cell phone talking to somebody. If you want to have people having conversation with each other, look at the drive time as a family as a non-device time.
I love that,
all devices have to be off, and this is not about intentions, it's about structure. When we're in the car together, no devices. Same thing with the family table. There should be rules. No devices at the family table. You want to get on the phone? Leave the table, but don't be looking at your emails while you're on the table. And that includes the father, and that includes the children. So the idea is set structure, and don't just think good intentions are enough. Good structure is necessary.
Scott?
Following all of that, what we're really talking about is communication, environmental hygiene. An opportunity to create space, time, and an environment that allows for a dialogue to take place. I've witnessed communication go from primarily verbal to letters to now emails, text, interactive video conversations, and all of them carry with them advantages and disadvantages. They also carry different intonations and tone. So one of the concerns that I have about today's environment is, what are the rules around the style of communication that will take place, and how is it going to be formed so that it is interactive? And I certainly have received plenty of texts and emails where I've lost my temper, but yet the transmission was not intended in that manner. So there's a miscommunication along the line that can be easily misunderstood versus the voice intonations, face-to-face, eye contact. So I think it's very important that families establish guidelines for how things are going to be communicated and what style and what will be the rules around give and take. So important.
Don?
So I love the ways that sometimes structures can really facilitate functional communication, and the folks in this room are often incredibly good at that with some of the families that we're working with. One thing I would like to add is there are times when creating some of these structures for deeper communication to happen before a family is ready, or before we know what might be a reason that they're avoiding each other, and really taking care of that. I think we have to also be careful that we don't take some of these rules and say more communication is better, because I have actually led family meetings where more communication actually created a bigger problem, because the family wasn't quite ready yet to be able to manage the energy, I guess, some of the intimate issues that were happening are very different than some of the issues around the content and the process of the business, or what's happening in the achievement system. The intimate system really needs to be taken care of as well, in order for these structures to be things that people willingly go toward and are interested in. And I think the opposite is true too. Sometimes people need to try them in order to get them interested. But we have to be very mindful of how ready they are and what are some of the things that might need to be taken care of before we encourage them to go into these structures.
Sharna, do we only need family retreats, constitutions, written documents for families to get together and have more structured, formal communication? It's great and it's good, but it seems like it should also be more consistent, natural, and desired throughout the whole year.
I certainly believe that those mechanisms mitigate and downplay anxiety that can arise in the system. However, I do think that communication is a skill, like anything else, that can be practiced. So in addition to bringing the portfolio or the asset allocation discussion or the philanthropic docket to the family table, we'll bring conversations as an agenda item to the family, and invite them to practice that. So for example, we believe that events and conditions that inform people's formative years lead to how they see the world. So for example, the historic economic events you've lived through, the parenting styles, even the music that you heard during your formative years leave a lasting impression on who you are and how we see the world. So we'll invite families just to bring awareness and even build empathy for the other people around the table by saying, tell me, what did you live through? What were the events that informed who you are and how you see the world and how that plays out in the way you make decisions around the table, so that when conflicts do arise or even votes come to the board table, you may know how your father, mother, sister, brother will vote, but now you know how come. You have a deeper fabric for understanding who they are and how they see the world, and you have more ability to stretch the rubber band, if you will, through your ability to communicate as a family.
Warren, in terms of communication, as a professional working with the family that might have a single family office, that likely has other advisors, a financial advisor, a tax advisor, and possibly a whole army of them, often it's not just you doing what you're doing in a silo. Even if the family doesn't note it, you would want to engage the other advisors and communicate with them. Is that easier said than done?
Well, it's important. I think that you know, the purpose of structured family meetings often is to make available the financial information that people otherwise don't talk about, make sure that everybody has a feeling that they have a chance to ask questions. You know, if you don't have the personal involvement of the family to begin with, then an extra family meeting is not going to help, and hopefully that goes on year-round. There are efforts to do that, but I think the point of the family meeting ought to be that the advisors are there and people can ask, family members can ask questions, can have an understanding of what's going on, of what's out there, what they would have to do if the patriarch, matriarch were not around, who they could look to for decisions. And I think certainly getting the various advisors together and getting them to work together is critical at those family meetings.
Absolutely. Cindy, in terms of, and we touched upon it earlier, but let's get your perspective. A family in a substantial business has younger children. Do they engage them in the good and the bad? Is everyone who's younger and not fully developed yet, are they really necessarily ready to handle bad news?
My feeling about that is that common sense is your best friend when you're thinking about younger kids and how to convey information to them, and less really is more with younger children. That, again, I think children will create their own fantasies about what's going on if they're not told. Now, if they're not aware that something's happening in the family system, then it's a judgment call about whether or not to share something. But in general, I think that accurate and honest, and also if it's something that needs to remain private, talking to younger children, using language like, this is something that we just want to talk about ourselves as a family, as opposed to implying secrecy about things is a healthier way to go. Secrets connote something negative, and later on in life, I think kids can look back and have negative feelings about that. It's not necessary to convey it that way. And I also, just picking up on what you were saying, asking children, especially young children, pointedly and directly, do you have questions about this, as your first point of communication and not your last, is very important, because oftentimes we don't know what their baseline knowledge is about an issue, and we don't want to necessarily, if it's a negative issue in the family, as it were a bad issue, as you were saying, we don't want to put ideas in their head. So first we want to find out, what actually are they thinking? What do they know? And then you go from there.
Yes, Scott?
I'm thinking about what Cindy just said and applying it not only to children but adults. We as leaders, when communicating something, need to be very mindful of who our audience is and what their capacity is to understand the message that we wish to deliver. So I think of words such as flexibility and pliability. We need to use, as Cindy said, common sense to appreciate, one, who is our audience, and two, what the message is. And I love what she said about starting the conversation with questions from them, because it allows you to determine where the bar is. But I think that everything that she said applies as much to any level of business or any level of family structure as it does to young children.
Don?
I'd just like to add on that side of what level of information is appropriate is so important. You know, the definition I love of a functional system is one that can contain its dysfunction. And so if, you know, let's say my wife and I are having some type of marital challenge. The interesting thing is, from almost infancy, children are so tuned into us that they know something is going on. They know that there's tension in the house. And to deny that, or to not acknowledge that something is going on, you know, and make them feel a little like something's wrong with them because they think something's going on, is often an alternative that parents use when they're trying to shelter their children from access to information that they're not ready for. I often think the most important thing is to divide content and process in communication. Just to say to a child, something bad is happening. Mom and dad can handle it. Even in a business situation, something bad is happening. I know you can sense it when I come home. Right now is not the time for us to talk about it, but I just want you to know that you're not wrong when you sense that something bad is going on. And so being able to separate content from process, I think, in communication is something that we sometimes miss.
In today's day and age, the information economy has enabled the next generation to have access to so much information at far younger ages. So clients used to ask me, at what age do we tell the kids anything? Now we know they can Google the value of the house, their private school education, the vacation, etc. And so more importantly, I think, is the ability of the parents to skill up the child or model for them how to deal with the information. What are the values we want to equip them with to manage that?
Absolutely. Larry, there's a perception that communication is verbal. And we are people and have been humans for thousands of years, and verbal is certainly very important. You can see emotions and it all ties in, but not everyone necessarily is going to be verbal, and communication means more than verbal. Someone mentioned earlier written, which seems so old-fashioned, but very touching, very warm, very personal, or email, or a Facebook post. Communication could be very different. It's not only just verbal.
Let me tackle this in a slightly different way and talk about 2 words I would love to outlaw in communication, and then 10 words I would like everybody to go up to New Hampshire to a tattoo parlor and stamp on their forehead.
I live in New Hampshire.
I'm sorry about that. It's the only place I know where they have legal tattoos. The 2 words I would like to see outlawed is "I understand." I think that's one of the most ineffective ways to communicate. When you say to somebody, "I heard what you said, I understand." Did you really? And here are the 10 words I want everybody to have a tattoo on their forehead. Let me summarize what you just said in my own words. In that way, we can both be sure that I understand what you said. Because what you said is not necessarily what I heard. Because I'm filtering your words through my head, and I may come up with something entirely different. And I find one of the most dysfunctional ways to communicate is to use the words "I understand" as a way of sort of shutting off communications. Whereas saying, "Let me summarize what I just heard you say in my words," really opens up communications.
Could there be less confusion with nonverbal writing or other methods where you're not interpreting someone's words and forgetting about it seconds later?
The problem with nonverbal is it's so much age specific, because if you're dealing with 14, 15-year-old kids, they may display a lot of nonverbal stuff. Walking out of the room, crying, etc. And then when you're dealing with adults, they may display too little nonverbal stuff. So you really can't be quite sure by judging nonverbals. But I think I can't overemphasize the importance of paraphrasing. And if I was going to give an analogy, so let's stop using the word communication because it gets us into trouble. Start using the word paraphrasing, and then you're going to get into some real communication.
Great point. Scott?
Larry, that reminds me of a conversation that I had with my dad where I was trying to make a point to one of our operations managers, and he just didn't get it. And I remember going back into my dad's office and expressing my frustration over the conversation. And he turned to me and he used to call me Scotty. He said, Scotty, remember one thing. He said, there is your story, there is his story, and then there is the truth. So you end up with 3 versions of the same thing. So to Larry's point, paraphrasing allows the differential to be understood between 2 parties. So I fully support that. I think that's wonderful.
Very well put.
And if I can
Yes,
add,
Don.
I do this exercise very often where people sit back to back with each other and one person builds something with a bunch of different color blocks and has to tell the other person how to build this thing without looking. The fascinating thing about that exercise is when I ask the person who did the sharing how confident they are that the other person got it, they're almost always high 90s in percentage in their idea of what they've communicated. Then they turn around and look at what the person built, and it's like completely different than what they actually were telling them to build. And so I do believe that this idea that we think we understood more than we actually understand, and we think that we communicated much more than the other person was able to understand, is kind of a fact of human relating that we have to that we have to take into account in all of these situations.
Angelo, I just wanted to say that, as a lawyer, I deal with the written word, of course, and the written word is usually what counts in the law, particularly when you're talking about somebody who's died and they've created wills and trusts, and all you have are those documents, and that's what you go by. I do encourage clients to give more guidance to their family in writing in forms of a letter of wishes, which is something that they have, offshore in the UK, and we don't use them as much here, but it's a letter of guidance, and somebody can be a bit more free-flowing in terms of how they want things to be done without being rigid. It's not the same as the person being there, but it's a lot better than a legal document drafted by a lawyer saying, all income to the spouse for life. The client can express in their own words why he's providing this or she's providing that, how they recommend that the children operate going forward, desire for the children to work together, and that can be a valuable thing.
There's been a little bit, Warren, of an increase in the use of videos and other forms of communication to share a little bit of a family history or what they want to have happen from the documents. Forget about from a legal perspective. I'm assuming that varies from what they say and by state. Do you find that to be an effective form of communication?
Some people are more comfortable with that, and it can make sense. I certainly don't recommend videotaping a will signing, but in terms of somebody some people think it's great. It's not.
Oh my God.
But videotaping somebody's wishes, if they're more comfortable speaking, and as a lot of people are, that can be a very good idea. Absolutely.
And Sharna, how can the next generation be encouraged to communicate on disagreements with the family?
So we believe in helping people to develop their own identity, their own self-awareness, which contains 3 elements, I think. One is upon whose shoulders am I standing, right? What's the legacy I'm inheriting from that family? What am I inheriting beyond the finances, for example, but the choices they made, the values that they passed down to me. Secondly, who am I as an independent adult? What do I value? What do I bring to the story? And thirdly, the combination of the 2, what do I want to do about it in the world? And so I think by actually helping someone move from adolescence to adulthood with a sense of identity, where do I come from, who am I, and what do I want to do about it in the world, we give them a compass. We give them the ability to face opportunities and conflicts equally, to be able to navigate them on their own.
At a younger age, Cindy, do you encourage, besides we all know the importance of verbal, as we discussed, skills in writing and articulating, but even new ways that people communicate, from texting, which is small, or Twitter, 144 characters, and Instagram or Facebook, whatever they're doing, and who knows what's to come, they're going to continue some form of communication as they grow older, later teens, early 20s, adulthood. Some communication is better than none at all. What's the belief on that?
Well, it's funny because in general, I think I'm always discouraging of that type of communication, but it's entirely unrealistic, and my own children have been my best sort of guides with this. That oftentimes I'll be looking at my son's texts and I'll think, oh my gosh, you responded in that way? What? And he'll say, no, I knew exactly what he was talking about. So they have a completely different barometer for how that communication can become effective and useful and functional that I don't think I have, because that's not ever something that I've done. So where they're coming at it, and I think the same way with issues of privacy, our perceptions of privacy and boundaries, having grown up in a a non-social media world when we were all younger, is entirely different from how they perceive privacy and boundaries now. So I often think that there's an over-communication via social media, but that is a complete it's like wearing a different headset, I think, to what kids are wearing now. So I've tried to get more on a realistic track about the function and the purpose that it serves, and it does serve a very, it serves an important purpose, I think, for children in terms of communicating. It's not my own method, but it's kind of agree to disagree and really accept that this is inevitable and it's happening, but to be obviously very smart and mindful about it and discuss that with the kids.
Excellent, thank you. This is Angelo Robles of Family Office Association. We hope you enjoyed our session on family communication. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Great job.